They said it was a place for care, a facility built to protect the vulnerable. But when investigators finally forced their way inside Pennhurst, what they saw didn't look like a hospital. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Children strapped to beds, adults with vacant eyes, rocking in corners. A stench so heavy that visitors gagged the moment they crossed the threshold. And the staff, some looked afraid, others looked numb. But a few looked like they enjoyed what was happening behind those locked doors. If you think you know the true story of Pennhurst State School, I promise you this: you've only heard the version they were willing to release. The real horrors, the ones buried under decades of silence and sealed reports, those were never meant to see daylight. Before we descend into this, hit subscribe now, because the deeper we go, the darker these stories get. And trust me, you're going to want someone to follow when the truth starts feeling a little too real. Pennhurst State School didn't begin as a monster. It began as an idea, a sprawling institution meant to care for society's undesirables, as the government coldly labeled them. People with disabilities, orphans, abandoned children, anyone the world didn't want to deal with. By the 1960s and 70s, Pennhurst had become a small city hidden in the Pennsylvania woods, complete with dormitories, tunnels, courtyards, punishment rooms, and entire wings lost to decay. The public believed it was simply overcrowded and underfunded. A tragic place, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for that era. But they didn't see what was happening after the doors closed. They didn't hear the screams echoing down the hallways at night. They didn't know that some staff members used isolation rooms as torture chambers, or that children who misbehaved were tied to benches for hours, sometimes days. This wasn't an institution. It was a warehouse for human suffering, and the state wanted it hidden. Because once you acknowledge what Pennhurst really was, you can't help but ask, how many people knew and stayed silent anyway? The horror begins long before the 60s. Pennhurst opened in 1908, and almost immediately the place filled far beyond capacity. But by the time the 1960s arrived, the situation mutated into something unspeakable. Former employees later testified that when new staff were hired, they weren't trained. They were warned. Don't touch the patients unless you want to get bitten. One supervisor reportedly said, and don't get too attached. You won't last long. That wasn't a joke. New hires either broke emotionally or adapted to the cruelty around them. Survivors from the era described the wards as cages for human beings. Rooms meant for 10 people held 50. Patients defecated on the floors. Some were forced to sleep in their own waste. Many didn't have clothes, either because they ripped them, or because staff didn't bother to replace them. And then there were the restraints. Leather straps, metal cuffs, wooden boards. Some children spent so many hours tied down that their muscles atrophied. Their bodies twisted into painful shapes that would never fully heal. The staff claimed it was necessary for safety. Investigators later said it was simply easier than dealing with them. Pennhurst had an underground tunnel system connecting different buildings. Officially, it was for transportation and utilities. Unofficially, former patients said the tunnels were where the worst punishments happened. One man, admitted in the late 1960s, remembered being dragged into the tunnels whenever he cried too loudly. It was cold and pitch black, he said. You could hear people breathing, but you couldn't see them. Sometimes they left me there, alone. Other times, someone else was already down there. Imagine being a child, locked in concrete darkness, hearing footsteps that don't belong to staff. The slow shuffle of someone who shouldn't be there. Someone who's been kept underground long enough to forget what sunlight looks like, and the experiments. Yes, experiments. Pennhurst had a reputation among certain doctors as a place where you could test things. Restraint techniques, behavioral conditioning, electroshock therapy. One nurse allegedly witnessed a doctor shocking a nonverbal patient repeatedly, not for treatment, but to see if he could force speech. The patient never spoke. He only screamed. These things weren't rumors. They were documented, sealed, hidden for decades. By the early 1970s, journalists and whistleblowers started noticing strange patterns. Patients disappearing from records. Staff turnover so high that some wards were run by people barely trained to lift a clipboard. A local news crew eventually snuck in with cameras and filmed conditions so horrific that the footage looked staged, like something from a horror film about an asylum. But it wasn't fiction. It was Tuesday at Pennhurst. The state panicked. Investigations began. But instead of shutting the place down immediately, officials tried to control the narrative, claiming conditions were improving. That budget increases were coming. That reforms were underway. Meanwhile, inside the walls, nothing changed. In the last years, before closure, something darker settled in. Visitors reported hearing whispers and footsteps in empty hallways. The kind of sounds that don't make sense in a living, functioning facility. Patients talked about the lady in white, a figure they claimed wandered the dorms at night. Staff dismissed it as delusion, but several employees admitted privately that they saw her, too, sometimes standing in the corner of a room, sometimes reflected in a window when no one was behind them. Paranormal investigators today say Pennhurst is one of the most active locations they've ever entered. But the truth is simpler. Places soaked in that much pain don't need ghosts. The walls themselves remember. When Pennhurst finally shut down in 1987, the state told the public it was due to budget issues and modern standards of care. But insiders said something else. Pennhurst didn't die peacefully. It rotted until it collapsed. The final years were filled with unexplained injuries, sudden deaths, and entire wings left abandoned because staff refused to work in them at night. And when the last patient was removed, something eerie happened. The screams didn't stop. Local residents claimed they could still hear them echoing from the woods. Former staff said they dreamed about the tunnels long after the keys were returned. And paranormal teams reported voices, clear voices, saying, "Dawn, leave us and help." The horrors of Pennhurst didn't stay locked inside. They lingered. Pennhurst State School, ISNT, just a tragic chapter in American history. It's a warning. A reminder that cruelty doesn't require monsters. It only requires people willing to look away. For decades, this institution consumed the forgotten, broke them, and discarded them. And the world barely blinked. And if a place like Pennhurst could exist in plain sight, hidden behind paperwork and polite excuses, then what else still exists right now that no one is checking? If you want more stories like this, the ones buried in shadows, the ones they tried to hide, the ones that force you to rethink what civilized society really means, hit that subscribe button and step further with me into the darkness. Just remember, places like Pennhurst never stay quiet forever. And some doors, once opened, don't close again.